Hello VR gamers. If you're trying to get good at Swordsman VR, here are 5 helpful tips and tricks that will have you slaying your opponents in no time flat. Number 1, go for weak spots. If there is one Swordsman VR tip that will benefit you more than any other, it's to learn to go for weak spots on your opponents, assuming you've turned armor physics on when starting the game, which you really should for a more fun experience. Seriously, you will hardly do any damage in this game if you just bang your blade against an opponent's heavily armored parts over and over. The way to do maximum damage in Swordsman VR is to look for weak spots. Each of the various types of opponents in this VR game have different weak spots, but once you find them, they are consistent. So once you find them, you'll know exactly where to strike over and over again. Basically, you want to look for areas where the body isn't covered by armor. If you strike a part of your enemy and hear a fleshy sound, see your blade sink in, and see blood, then you're hitting them in the right place. The upper torso, stomach, and arms will often be defended by thick armor, though that is not always the case, as you'll see in the tip after this one. There's always some sort of opening leading to the face, but those are often very hard to hit and can be quite small on some enemies, though hitting an opponent's head does do incredibly high damage if you can pull it off. So if you think you can finesse a hit to the face, then go for it, especially if you just parried successfully and activated slow motion. Some opponents also don't wear helmets, so if you see a completely unprotected head, always go for it for a quick victory. Some enemy types have more armor and others have less, but all of them have weak spots on their legs. Going for the legs is a very tried and true strategy in Swordsman VR. While you'll learn what enemies have armor in what spots over time through trial and error, start with the legs. Even bosses all have some unarmored part somewhere on their legs. Now for tip number 2, certain enemy types are easier than others. When starting a new game in Swordsman VR, you might be tempted to start from the left of the opponent list and do them in order. The typical thought is that the beginner stuff would be at the beginning of the list, right? Well, that's not the case in this game. The first entry on the list of opponent types to fight against in Swordsman VR are knights, and knights are extremely well armored and so very difficult to take down for a beginner. Instead, let's take a lesson from our previous tip and start with opponent types that actually wear less armor and so are way easier to take down. This way, even with your starter gear and lack of stats, you can get some victories under your belt and accumulate some wealth and levels that will make taking out the more difficult opponents easier. I recommend that you start by fighting the Vikings or the Samurai. Vikings are the least armored opponents in the game, and you can even stab them right through the chest or side. Their only truly armored areas are their stomach and heads. Though the Vikings do incredible damage to a low-level player with no armor and can take you down in a single hit or two if you're not careful, so another alternative is fighting the Samurai. While the Samurai are more armored than their Viking counterparts, their legs and most of their arms are basically free game, and some will even spawn without helmets for easy head-chopping wins. You can also just vary between the two if you get bored with one enemy type, but if you want to play optimally, focus on getting a lot of victories so you'll have golden experience to spend to become more powerful. Tip number 3, upgrade your gear and spend your money wisely. There are 3 ways to become more powerful in Swordsman VR: by getting better weapons, better armor, and better stats. Weapons and armor are bought with money, and stats are gained with experience, both of which are earned from winning in the arena. When you're just starting out, keep in mind that you can always pick up the weapons of fallen enemies, which can be significantly stronger than those that you start with. You can view the stats of all weapons in the buy menu, and they apply to the weapons of your enemies as well. Though you'll probably notice in the buy menu that there are a few upgrades you can get for extremely cheap early on. The Viking sword is cheap, and so is the katana. Both are big upgrades over your 2 starting options, the cutlass and the half sword. You'll also benefit from buying the cheapest quiver of arrows, even if you don't plan on bringing in a bow. This still lets you pick up the bows of fallen enemies and use them with the arrows in your quiver. Otherwise, you won't have any arrows on you, though enemies do drop a few if they came in with a bow. Just like all other enemy equipment, they will disappear if they're on the ground for long enough. Also, keep in mind that you have a limited number of arrows, so if you're thinking of going straight for a bow and arrows to play keep away with your opponents, then think again, because you can't just plink them from a distance forever. Though if you miss, you can still pick up arrows off of the ground for a limited amount of time and from inside of your enemies. A more expensive upgrade is armor, but investing just a few thousand into a new set of armor can make you significantly stronger early on in the game. My recommendation is to go for the Viking armor and helmet as soon as possible. It not only is a great upgrade in defense, but also makes you do a ton more damage. Oh, and if you have a problem with getting hit and losing a lot, then try going with the shield and single-handed weapon combo. A shield is a great way to not get hit and a very easy defensive measure. You can even hit an enemy with your shield to throw them off balance, it's more effective than kicking. Tip number 4, upgrade your stats and spend experience wisely. So we've already mentioned that you get experience alongside gold when you win. Well, just like gold, you have some options of how to spend it. And if you want to get powerful and start challenging bosses, you're going to want to think hard about how you spend your experience on your early levels. There are a lot of stats to choose from and a lot of different play styles you can try with different combinations of stats. You could maximize your chances for slow motion so that you can use chrono time to go for quick face stabs on your enemies. You can maximize speed and run around using up your arrows and doing hit and run attacks. The simplest long-term plan is just to increase your damage and health by investing into vitality and strength. A lot of weapons also have a minimum strength requirement to use. Luckily, you can always respec later when you're rich and powerful, and so you can spend your experience like you want without having to worry about needing to start all over again to try a different combination. So, to get rich and powerful as quickly as possible, you can try to accelerate your growth by investing early into the greed and intelligence stats. These will increase how much money and experience you get for winning. Since the early levels are very cheap, it's worth getting a few before your first respec so that you can get better rewards when you need them the most. Of course, once greed and intelligence levels start becoming expensive, you might want to spend your experience elsewhere so that you can have the stats to keep up with your opponents and be stronger in a fight. Tip number 5, be patient. Your biggest advantage against your enemies in Swordsman VR, except maybe for the fact that you are human and can't outsmart them, is that you regenerate health. When you take damage, you'll notice your screen going dark and the edges of your vision graying. Whenever you see this, immediately back off from the fight and just focus on defense for a while. Your enemies will generally be very slow to catch up with you and keep attacking, unless you're up against a ranged enemy, so hopefully you've got a shield or something to hide behind if that's the case, though you can also just constantly just strafe around at a distance so they miss. Anyway, once you back away, you'll regenerate your health and your vision will return to normal in like a few seconds. Your enemies, with the exception of one boss that can heal himself, do not. This advice holds up the best against bosses. They have incredible amounts of health and fighting them is a marathon. Even with good weapons and high damage stats, you'll still need to hit them a lot for them to go down. Push your luck once when you're wounded and you'll have to start all over. So if you get hit, be patient and wait until you're back to full strength to continue the attack. If you've got a tip for Swordsman VR of your own or would like to see some tips for another VR game, then feel free to leave a comment. Those are all the Swordsman VR tips and tricks that I've got for you. Enjoy yourselves out there, VR gamers.